In my presentation, I'm going to address a very specific argument supporting a specific version of a moral view held by a certain movement. So as an introduction, I will briefly present the context going from the least specific to the most specific. First, the movement I will talk about is effective altruism. Effective altruism is a philosophical and social movement that was created at the turning of the 2010s. The movement uses evidences and careful reasoning to identify the most effective ways to use our resources to maximize well-being and is committed to support the identified most effective initiatives. For instance, the movement spends around $100 million per year to support what they identify as the most effective initiatives. So most of it went to address global poverty. However, recently the movement started to turn its attention from the global poor to the future people. And according to longtermism, there is potentially so much more people in the far future that we ought to take their interests into account in our moral assessment today. So longtermism can be more or less strong. For instance, there is what we can call deontic weak longtermism. This is simply the view that we ought to do more for the far future than what we are doing today. However, there is also what we call deontic strong longtermism. This is the view that in the most important decision facing agent today, what career to choose, where to make one's donation, in what programs government should invest, and so forth, we ought to choose the option that does the most good in the far future. And in this presentation, I'm going to address this specific version of longtermism. As you might have guessed from the word choice, the most good, deontic strong longtermism is defended on consequentialist ground. However, in the article, The Case for Strong Longtermism, the authors argue that even if consequentialism was false, deontological views would still hold deontic strong longtermism. In fact, they argue that plausible deontological views would just become existentially equivalent to consequentialism. Existentially equivalent just means that they would prescribe the same action, i.e. whatever action deontic strong longtermism implies. I will argue that this is false and that their argument does not hold. In the first part of my talk, I'm going to present the argument they developed to support their view that plausible deontological views will just become existentially equivalent to consequentialism. Here is the reconstructed argument that they make. P1. Plausible deontological views ought to become existentially equivalent to consequentialism when addressing very high stakes. P2. Existential risks present astronomically high stakes. Therefore, when addressing existential risks, plausible deontological views ought to become existentially equivalent to consequentialism. So, to present their argument, I will first clarify what is a plausible deontological view, and then present P1 and P2 and show how they come together to make their conclusion. In the second part of my talk, I will argue that even if we agree with everything that he postulated, their argument is lacking an important necessary condition. Their argument only works for what I call imminent high stakes, but it does not work for distant high stakes. As existential risks present distant high stakes, I will show that their argument does not work for the case they are interested in. You can see here in red the elements that I added to include the necessary condition, and I also added the negation resulting from it. So to make my argument, I will first present what I mean by imminent and distant high stakes, and I then argue for P1 and P2, and conclude by showing the implication of their view and of my criticism. First, what is a plausible deontological view? So according to the authors, a view is plausible when it is moderately stake-sensitive, and moderately stake-sensitive views are views for which, as the stakes get higher and higher, less and less side constraints should hold. Of course, there are some side constraints that can always hold, like not killing your children, even if doing so you would save many lives in the far future. We are talking here about realist cases. So to support the criteria of moderate stake sensitivity, the authors gives two examples, the Nazi officer case and the wartime example. First, the Nazi officer case is the classical example we all know. A Nazi officer comes to a house and asks the inhabitants if they hide Jews, and they in fact hide Jews. So there are mainly two options, either to lie and save the people and put yourself at risk, or to tell the truth. A person arguing that she ought to tell the truth because of the side constraint not to lie would be called crazy. Why? because the stakes are so high that the side constraint should not hold in this case. The side constraint to not lie is quite weak, but other side constraints have more weight to them, like citizen rights. So they would require higher stakes to be overridden. So let's take the wartime case. In peacetime, governments ought to not infringe on the rights of citizens, even if it would maximize the good to do so. However, when the stakes get really high, like during wartime, our intuition change. The side constraints that are rights ought to not hold anymore because the stakes are so high. The lives of many people are on the line, their freedom, everything they build, and so forth. As we see in both these examples, the Nazi officer case and the wartime case, when the stakes get higher and higher, less and less side constraints should hold. So now let's turn to P2 to complete our argument. Existential risks present astronomically high stakes. Existential risks are risks that might make humanity go extinct or something of this magnitude. If the chain of humanity was to get cut, then we would not just lose 8 billion people, represented here by the red symbol, but we would lose all people from future generations, represented here with the blue symbols. To be accurate, we would need 20,000 slides of blue symbols to represent them according to long-termism. Don't worry, I will not do that, but the point is that the stakes are astronomical. So we are ready now to turn to their conclusion. As the stakes get higher and higher, less and less side constraints should hold. As the stakes are astronomical, no side constraint should hold. So as deontological views take into consideration consequences and side constraint, if there are no side constraints, only consequences are left, and a view only basing its moral assessment on consequences is just existentially equivalent to consequentialism. So let's now go to the criticism of the argument that I will make. I will argue that an important necessary condition is missing in their argument, a distinction between what I call distant high stakes and imminent high stakes. So we'll first present these two concepts and then show how they change the premises and in turn the conclusion. When we look in the dictionary, imminence refers to something close in time. This is a good start, but the technical use I make of imminent and distant enriches this definition to make it more operationalized by including the context. Let's take the example of a professor that has 6 months to write a paper to keep her job. So the stakes are high. We can wonder, is the deadline of 6 months imminent or distant? Most people would answer that it depends on what time of the year it is, on which kind of other obligation the professor has, is she in sabbatical, and so forth. The imminence of something is strongly determined by the time frame, but this time frame is relative to the context. So here is what I propose as a definition integrating contextual elements to the time frame. So I would argue that something is imminent if there are only extreme solutions to address what is at stake. Let's take again the example of the professor. If the professor is in sabbatical with no other obligation, she can write the article by working, let's say, 30 hours per week for a month, or 15 hours a week for 2 months. Nothing extreme. Normal weeks with a lot of free time afterward. So it doesn't look extreme, so we can say that this is not imminent, this is probably distant. However, if she gives 3 courses during the 6 months, she has many other obligations and she has a child to take care of, the options available to her are very limited and all extreme. For instance, she might have a solution that would consist of exploiting her TA by giving them a part of her responsibility, so she has some time to write. She could stop her social life completely during the time of the writing. She could send her kid to some family members so they can take care of the kid, and so forth. So in this case, because of the context, there seem to only have extreme solutions. Therefore, in this case, 6 months is imminent. So this is the definition I give of imminent. Distant high stakes are a little bit more tricky. So here's the definition I will give. High stakes are distant if there is at least one available option that is not extreme. So let's clarify at least 2 of these claims. First, I just use the word one. So for our options to not be distant, we only need a single option. A single non-extreme option for a situation is enough to solve it. Second, by extreme, I mean options for which we make very important compromises or pay a very high price, or things of this nature. I know that this is quite vague, but it is a very general idea that needs some flexibility depending on the cases. So now that we have both of these definitions, let's turn to P1. In the premise, argue that the argument of the author only works for imminent high stakes, but not for distant high stakes. When there are only extreme solutions to address the high stakes, and the high stakes have to absolutely be addressed, then of course the ontological view would just prescribe the same action as consequentialism does. The problem is that the two examples that they give to support their argument are imminent high stakes, so the argument obviously works. But my argument is that their argument does not work only for distant high stakes. So the two cases do not rule out my argument. So my argument to support my premise will start by demonstrating that the cases are imminent, and then I will show that when we transform one of the cases to make it a distant high stakes, then the argument does not hold anymore. The first element to notice in the Nazi officer case is that the officer arrives by surprise, leaving no preparation time for the inhabitants, making their options very limited, either to tell the truth and making their refugee being killed, that is extreme, or to lie and probably save the refugee's life, but maybe put themselves at risk of being added to the body count, and other extreme options. The same applies to the wartime example. Wars are extreme times, and generally they take us by surprise, leaving only few extreme solutions available. However, if we change the case of the Nazi officer to be distant high stakes, our intuition changes. However, if we change the case of the Nazi officer to be distant high stakes, our intuition changes. Let's say that the Nazi officer notices the inhabitants a day in advance that they're going to have a chit-chat. This opens up new option on which deontologists and consequentialists might disagree. The deontologist inhabitants, having the side constraint not to lie, would certainly take the option to help the refugees by putting them outside of the house until the officer would have passed. In this case, they do not have to lie, so they respect their side constraints, and the refugees are probably safe. However, it is certainly more dangerous to be outside of the home than inside the home, so you have some setback there. But it seems to be the best solution in the deontological framework. You respect the side constraint, and you still save the lives of the people. On the other hand, consequentialist inhabitants might argue that if they estimate the danger of being outside of the home to be high enough, then it would maximize the good to lie and keep them inside, protected. On a consequentialist analysis, both views are different and plausible. I would argue that this is so because it is hard to know which view would bring the best consequences, as there is a lot of epistemic uncertainty. How less secure is it to be outside of the home rather than inside of the home? How likely are we to be caught lying, and so forth? No matter how good one is to estimate the probability of events, it is impossible to have a perfect estimate of these probabilities. And a slight change in probabilities would flip the outcome around. Therefore, the deontologist response is certainly plausible and different from the consequentialist response. Thus, as we have just seen, when the high stakes are distant, there are more non-extreme options available. And in these cases, the side constraint can taint the choice of action to make deontologists prefer a different option than what consequentialists would choose. Moreover, this option remains plausible because of high epistemic uncertainty. And maybe as a side note, side constraints are not just constraints on action, as the authors seem to suggest. Under high epistemic uncertainty, side constraints are interesting tools to maximize the good in the long run. Let's take the example of lying. Lying is a good way to maximize the good in certain instances. However, lies are unstable. They might get uncovered, and this would result in losing the gain plus an added disvalue like losing the trust of someone or losing some friendship and so forth. Moreover, the problem with lies is that they are also high maintenance. You need to lie again when facing the same question, you need other cover-up lies, and every time one lies, the added disvalue become worse. All cover-up lies become occasion to get the lie uncovered, and to require further cover-up lies and so forth. Because of our epistemic uncertainty, about what the lies will imply in the future, a side constraint to not lie might become a great tool to maximize the good in the long run. In fact, this is the claim of rule utilitarianism. In brief, there is good reasons to believe that when epistemic uncertainty is high, there are good reasons to have side constraints to mitigate the uncertainty and bring the best consequences. Let's turn now to P2. To defend now the second premise, that existential risks are mainly distant high stakes, I will base my defense on The Precipice by Toby Ord, the Bible of existential risks. There are 4 main categories of existential risks, 3 of which are clearly distant, while one category is much more challenging for my argument, so my argument will focus on this one. So now let's go fast through the 3 types that are distant high stakes. First, there are natural existential risks, like supervolcano eruption, asteroid impacts, and the likes. These existential risks all have an expected risk of around 1 chance out of 10,000 per century, so very distant high stakes. The second group of existential risks are what I call the low anthropogenic risks: climate change, nuclear war, and other environmental damages. According to longtermism, they all have a 1 chance out of 1,000 probability per century to be an existential threat. So very distant again. It is not that long-termists think that they are not dangerous, but that they do not threaten human extinction. Even that version of climate change would not wipe out humanity completely. Third, we have what they call unforeseen anthropogenic risks that we are not aware yet, and that might threaten us in the short future. Not much could be said about them, so let's skip to the most interesting category. Finally, the most interesting one for my argument is the high anthropogenic risks, composed of AI risks, 1 chance out of 10 per century, and engineered pandemics, 1 chance out of 30 to get extinct in the next century. So first, regarding AI risks, the first thing to notice is that even if we try really hard, we might never be able to create a super AI that would have the capacity to destroy us all. Moreover, even if we create it, it is far from obvious that it would be a threat to our safety to reach its side's goal. Thus, I am not convinced that we can make it an imminent threat, as it might never occur. But more importantly for our analysis is the fact that because it does not yet exist, there are 2 main routes to address the issue. One route that consequentialists would certainly favor, and another route that deontologists would favor. Deontologists are risk-averse and not gain-seeking. Thus, they mainly aim to avoid doing harm and care less about doing the most good possible. As AI can do a lot of good and a lot of harm, deontologists would certainly favor means that would stop certain development of AI, that would slow it down as much as possible in some ways, at least, everything to be a pain for the developers. On the other hand, consequentialists, as they are gain-seeker and much less risk-averse, would certainly favor a development of AI with a lot of investment to secure it, to avoid the harm it could cause. In my opinion, both approaches are plausible. If AI is really that dangerous, and maybe even more impossible to control than we thought, then deontologists would be certainly right. But if we are just facing a moral panic, and it's not that dangerous, then consequentialists would be right. The important thing for my argument is that the deontological perspective is plausible and not the same as the consequentialist for these existential risks. Now, regarding the engineered pandemics risks, the case is much harder to make and requires much more nuanced answer. However, for the sake of argument, I already shown that the 3 first categories are distant high stakes, and that the main threat, according to longtermism, is also distant high stakes. And thus my version of P2, I think, is completed for the sake of my argument. As a conclusion, I would pass through my argument quickly. First, as we said in P1, moderately stake-sensitive deontological views ought not to become existentially equivalent when the high stakes are distant. When there are many options available, deontological views can take care of the high stakes, and the side constraint can taint their conclusion. as we have high uncertainty about the option bringing the best consequences, deontological views are not necessarily implausible for proposing a different options than consequentialist views. P2. Existential risks, high stakes are distant. Existential risks are not like wartime or a visit from a Nazi officer in which we are faced with the necessity to take an immediate action of a certain nature. Of course we have to act now, but the idea is that there is so much more latitude than when we're faced with a war or a decision that could alter the lives of people. Because of these two premises, the argument of the authors seems to only hold if we were on the precipice of humanity extinction, when there are only high-risk solutions available. However, we are not in such a world, and therefore deontological views ought not yet to be existentially equivalent to consequentialism. Finally, an important implication of the argument of the authors is that long-termism does not have to listen to deontological perspective to orientate their actions. On the one hand, if the deontological view is considered to be not plausible, then they do not have to listen to it. On the other hand, if the deontological view is plausible, then it is just supposed to come to the same prescription, the same conclusion than consequentialist views. So why bother considering these views? Because we already have the right answer. As I have shown in my argument, side constraints are a great tool under high epistemic uncertainty, and long-termism ought to use them to constrain their action to avoid unforeseen disasters. As long-termism becomes more and more influential, the discussion about the place of deontology in long-termism is one of the most important discussions we can have about our future, because we need some constraints on action to ensure that views like long-termism would not go out of hand.